Frank Miller, an 82-year-old Vietnam War hero, collapses on Main Street, clutching a grocery bag, whispering for James Henderson. Sarah, a passerby, stays by his side as a mysterious helicopter thunders closer, hinting at secrets from Frank's past. Mark Davis, another veteran, recognizes Frank and calls James, a man bound by a decades-old promise. As the crowd gathers, the Blackhawk lands, and James, a former lieutenant saved by Frank in Vietnam, arrives. The town watches, stunned, as Frank's hidden heroism unravels. What promise did Frank call in, and what will James reveal about their shared past? Frank's story shows heroes walk among us unnoticed. Share this tale of courage and kindness. Like, subscribe, and join our channel to uncover more stories of everyday heroes. In the comments, tell us about a quiet hero you've met who deserves to be honored. Let's spread their stories together. The wind whipped down Main Street, sharp and unforgiving, tugging at Frank Miller's worn coat as he shuffled along a sidewalk. His right hand gripped a tattered grocery bag, its thin plastic straining under the weight of apples, a loaf of bread, and a small carton of milk. His left hand, gnarled and trembling, clutched the collar of his jacket, pulling it tighter against the biting chill. At 82, Frank's shoulders sagged, not just from the malm, but from the invisible burden of decades, years of war, loss, and quiet resilience that he carried alone. Each step was deliberate, his knees protesting with every movement, yet he pressed forward, as he always had, with a stubborn determination that defined him. Then, without warning, his legs buckled. The grocery bag slipped from his grasp, hitting the pavement with a dull thud. Apples spilled out, rolling into the street, some crushed under the tires of a passing car. Frank crumpled to the ground, his body folding like a brittle leaf. Pain shot through his hip, where shrapnel from a long-ago jungle ambush still lay embedded, a silent reminder of battles he'd survived. His trembling hand reached out, clawing at the cold asphalt, as if grasping for something or someone just beyond his reach. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle, but his voice, faint and cracked, broke through the hum of traffic. "Sarah, tell James Henderson," he rasped, his words barely audible over the wind and the indifferent roar of the world around him. Sarah, a young woman who'd been hurrying past with her scarf wrapped tightly against the cold, stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened, her heart lurching at the sight of the old man sprawled on the ground. She didn't know Frank, not really. Just the familiar face of the elderly man who always nodded politely when she passed him in the grocery store. But now his weathered face was pale, his eyes glassy with pain, and his voice carried a desperate urgency that sent a shiver down her spine. Dropping to her knees beside him, she fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy with panic. "Hold on, sir, I'm calling for help," she said, her voice trembling as she dialed 911. But Frank's words echoed in her mind. James Henderson. Who was that? Why did it matter so much to this frail, collapsing man? She leaned closer, her breath catching, as she saw the faint flicker of determination in his eyes. "Sir, I've got help coming. Just stay with me," she urged, her voice soft but firm, masking the fear knotting her chest. Moments later, the distant thrum of helicopter blades sliced through the air, growing louder, more insistent, as it raced toward the heart of town. The sound seemed out of place, almost surreal, in this sleepy community where the biggest excitement was the annual fair. But for Frank, it was a signal, a lifeline tied to a promise made half a century ago. Frank Miller had been a fixture in this town for decades, as much a part of the landscape as the old oak in the town square. To most, he was just the quiet old man with the stooped back, the one who walked to the grocery store every Tuesday, rain or shine, with that same worn bag in hand. His face, etched with deep lines like a map of a hard-lived life, was familiar but unremarkable to the townsfolk. Few knew more than his name, and fewer still cared to ask. He lived alone in a modest brick house on the edge of town, a place that mirrored his own weathered resilience. The paint on the shutters flaked away, curling like dead skin, and the roof dipped slightly in the middle. But Frank kept it neat, sweeping the porch and trimming the sparse grass with a precision that hinted at his disciplined past. A faded American flag hung by the front door, its edges frayed but still catching the breeze, a quiet testament to a life of service. The mailbox, rusted and leaning slightly, bore the name F. Miller in letters so worn they were nearly illegible, much like the man himself in the eyes of those who passed by. But Frank was more than the sum of his routines. 50 years ago, he'd been a U.S. Marine, a young man thrust into the chaos of the Vietnam War. He'd fought through dense jungles where every step could trigger a mine or an ambush. Sleepless nights blurred into days of gunfire and fear, moments of raw terror interwoven with acts of courage that left scars, both visible and unseen. Shrapnel had torn into his hip during a brutal firefight, and a second wound had nearly cost him his arm, yet he'd pressed on, leading his squad through hell and back. He carried the Purple Heart in a drawer at home, tucked away with other relics of a life he rarely spoke of, not out of shame, but because the weight of those memories was his alone to bear. The war had marked him deeply, not just in his body but in his soul, where the faces of fallen comrades lingered like ghosts. When he returned home, Frank slipped quietly into civilian life, as if the war had been a fever dream he could leave behind. He worked at the local factory, a steady job that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. He paid his bills on time, never missed a rent payment, and married Helen, a kind woman with a laugh that could light up even his darkest days. They dreamed of a family, of a house filled with children's voices, but fate was unkind. Helen was diagnosed with cancer in her 30s, and by her early 40s, she was gone, leaving Frank with a void that never quite closed. They'd had no children, no legacy to carry their love forward, and so Frank rebuilt his life alone, brick by brick, with the same stubborn resolve that had carried him through war. He was fiercely independent, refusing to lean on anyone even as age crept in. His knees ached, his hands shook, but he patched his own roof when it leaked, shoveled his driveway through bitter winters, and carried his groceries home without complaint. To neighbors, he was courteous but distant, offering a nod or a quiet morning, but never lingering for small talk. The teenagers who sped by on their bikes saw only an old man, oblivious to the fact that he'd once navigated minefields and dragged wounded men to safety under enemy fire. The cashier at the market, who rang up his apples and bread each week, didn't notice the faint scars on his arms, marks from a day when he'd shielded his unit from a grenade. Frank never shared his story, and the town, caught up in its own rhythm, never thought to ask. Over time, his past faded into the background, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Yet a few remembered. A handful of veterans in town still greeted Frank with a quiet nod, a shared understanding passing between them. The postman who'd served in a later war sometimes paused at Frank's mailbox, sensing the weight of a life unspoken. And James Henderson, Frank's last whispered plea, knew more than most. In Vietnam, James had been a terrified 20-year-old lieutenant, fresh-faced and overwhelmed when their convoy was ambushed. Flames roared, bullets tore through the air, and James was trapped, pinned under wreckage, certain he'd die. It was Frank, bloodied and limping from his own wounds, who dragged him to safety, refusing to leave him behind. That day, James had made a vow. If you ever need me, Frank, no matter when, no matter where, I'll come. They'd seen each other only sparingly since, their lives diverging, but the promise held fast, a thread unbroken by time. Now that promise was being called upon. Sarah knelt beside Frank on the freezing sidewalk, her body shielding him from the wind as she clutched his frail hand. His skin felt paper thin, his fingers cold and trembling as they weakly squeezed hers. Her heart pounded, a mix of fear and responsibility pressing down on her. She'd already called 911, her voice shaking as she told the dispatcher. An elderly man collapsed on Main Street near the coffee shop. He's conscious, but barely. Please hurry. But Frank's faint whisper cut through her panic. Don't call an ambulance, he murmured, his voice so weak it was almost lost to the wind. Call my friend, James Henderson. Sarah frowned, leaning closer, her breath visible in the cold air. James Henderson, sir? Who is he? Help is already coming, she said, her voice gentle but urgent. But Frank's head tipped slightly, his eyelids fluttering as his breath grew shallower. He seemed to drift, caught between the present and some distant memory. Sarah bit her lip, her mind racing. She didn't know what else to do. She'd called for help, she'd stayed by his side, but Frank's words felt like a sacred charge, a final wish she couldn't ignore. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the sight of the old man on the ground and the young woman kneeling beside him. Their murmurs blended with the wind, but Sarah barely noticed. Her focus locked on Frank's face, searching for any sign he was still with her. The helicopter's roar grew louder, its shadow sweeping over the street, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Whatever was happening, whoever James Henderson was, she sensed that this moment would unravel the quiet life of Frank Miller, revealing a man the town had never truly known. The biting chill of the late afternoon seeped through Sarah's coat as she knelt beside the crumpled figure of Frank Miller on the cold pavement. Her hands trembled, not just from the frigid air but from the weight of the moment, the fragile life she was trying to anchor with her presence. Around her, a small crowd had gathered in, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Some stood a few steps back, arms folded tightly against the wind, their hushed whispers blending into the faint hum of the city. Others fumbled with their phones, fingers hovering over screens, torn between capturing the scene for some fleeting moment of virality or stepping forward to offer help. Sarah's heart ached at their indecision, her eyes darting between Frank's pale face and the strangers who seemed to see him as little more than a spectacle. She wanted to shout at them, to demand they do something, but her voice felt trapped, her focus tethered to the shallow rise and fall of Frank's chest. From the edge of the crowd, a figure broke through, his movements deliberate, parting the onlookers like a ship cutting through waves. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that spoke of discipline, of years spent standing at attention. His dark coat flapped slightly in the breeze, and as he drew closer, Sarah caught the fleeting pallor that crossed his face when his eyes landed on Frank. For a moment he seemed to falter, his breath catching as he murmured, almost to himself, Frank Miller. The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. He stepped forward, his boots clicking softly against the pavement, and knelt on the opposite side of Frank, his hand brushing the old man's shoulder with a gentleness that contrasted with his imposing frame. Sarah's gaze flicked to his face, searching for answers in the lines etched around his eyes. The tightness of his jaw. There was something there. Grief, perhaps, or guilt, or some tangled mix of both. Frank, the man said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of familiarity. It's Mark Davis. At the sound of his name, Frank's eyes fluttered open, a faint spark of recognition flickering in their cloudy depths. His lips twitched as if trying to form words, but no sound came. Sarah's confusion deepened, her grip on Frank's hand tightening instinctively. She looked up at the stranger, Mark, and her voice broke through her hesitation. "Do you know him?" she asked, her words tinged with both hope and suspicion. Mark nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Frank's face. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone with a practiced motion, his fingers moving swiftly over the screen. "Yeah," he said, his voice softer now, almost reverent. "I know him." He pressed the phone to his ear, and as it began to ring, his gaze dropped back to Frank. A shadow passed over his features, something like regret or maybe resignation. "You really called it in, didn't you, old man?" he murmured, his words laced with a bittersweet edge that Sarah couldn't quite decipher. She strained to hear as Mark spoke into the phone, his voice dropping to a low, urgent cadence. "James, it's Mark Davis. It's Frank. Yeah, it's happening." There was a pause, and though Sarah couldn't make out the words from the other end, the sharpness of the voice carried through the air, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Mark's lips curved into a grim smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, it's time." He ended the call with a quick tap, slipping the phone back into his pocket. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of what he'd just set in motion was pressing down on him. Sarah's heart raced, her mind scrambling to piece together the fragments of what she'd heard. "Who's James?" she asked, her voice catching in her throat. "Is help coming?" Mark's gaze softened as he met her eyes, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of warmth in his expression. "Help's coming," he said, his tone reassuring but cryptic. He hesitated, then added, "Just not the kind you were expecting." The words sent a shiver down her spine, not from the cold, but from the sudden realization that she was caught in something far larger than a simple act of kindness on a city street. Frank stirred again, his frail body shifting slightly beneath the worn fabric of his jacket. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and Sarah's eyes were drawn to the details she hadn't noticed before. The thin scar tracing the edge of his way, the rough calluses on his hands, the marks of a life lived hard and long. Her throat tightened, a rush of unexpected emotion welling up inside her. She didn't know this man, didn't know his story, yet the quiet dignity in his fading smile pierced her heart. She squeezed his hand, willing him to hold on, to know he wasn't alone. Mark stood, his eyes scanning the horizon, his posture shifting back to that military alertness. Sarah followed his gaze, her brows furrowing as she noticed something strange. A subtle vibration in the air, a deep, pulsing sound that didn't belong to the rhythm of the city. It was faint at first, like a heartbeat felt through the ground, but it grew steadily louder, more insistent. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't answer immediately. He just watched the sky, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in a way that held both pride and sorrow. "That," he said finally, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning, "is the sound of old promises being kept." The words hung between them, cryptic and weighty, and Sarah felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. The sound grew louder, unmistakable now, a rhythmic thump like the beating of some great mechanical heart. The crowd around them stirred, heads turning, fingers pointing upward. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as she followed their gazes. Above the rooftops, a dark shape emerged against the pale winter sky. A helicopter, its massive rotors slicing through the air with a deep, resonant thump that rattled the shop windows and sent dry leaves skittering along the sidewalk. A Blackhawk, Sarah realized with a jolt, her mind struggling to process the sight of a military aircraft descending onto Main Street. Mark stepped back to Frank's side, kneeling once more. "Hang in there, old friend," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You are not leaving alone." Frank's fingers tightened faintly around Sarah's, his lips moving again, though no sound escaped. She leaned closer, catching the barest whisper of a name. James Henderson. The name sent a fresh wave of questions crashing through her mind, but there was no time to ask them. The helicopter's shadow swept over the street, its downdraft whipping through the crowd, stirring dust and debris. Sarah shielded her face, her hair whipping wildly in the rising wind. The aircraft hovered briefly, then descended with precision, its landing skids barely clearing the pavement. The door swung open, and through the swirling dust, Sarah caught glimpses of movement. Figures in dark uniforms, their faces obscured, their movements swift and purposeful. The crowd swelled, people spilling out from nearby shops, workers abandoning their posts, pedestrians freezing mid-step. Murmurs of confusion rippled through them, punctuated by the occasional gasp or whispered question. "Is this real?" someone muttered behind Sarah, their voice trembling with disbelief. Police cars screeched to a halt nearby, their lights flashing, sirens wailing briefly before officers stepped out, shouting for the crowd to step back. Fire trucks rolled in moments later, ladders clattering, their crews exchanging bewildered glances as they tried to make sense of the scene unfolding before them. Sarah's grip on Frank's hand tightened, her heart hammering as she felt the tremor that ran through his body. His lips moved again, the faintest breath of sound escaping. "James," he whispered, and Sarah's eyes stung with tears she hadn't realized were forming. She looked up at the helicopter, its dark silhouette looming against the sky, and a sudden sharp clarity washed over her. This was no ordinary rescue. This was something far bigger, something tied to the scars on Frank's jaw, the calluses on his hands, the weight of Mark's regret, and the name that lingered on Frank's lips. As the dust swirled and the rotors thundered, Sarah knew with a certainty that both terrified and awed her that she had stumbled into the final chapter of a story she might never fully understand. Under the stark glow of streetlights, a towering figure descended with purpose, stepping into the chaos of Main Street. James Henderson was no longer clad in the crisp uniform of his past, but his presence carried the unmistakable weight of a man who had once led battalions. His silver hair, cropped close to his scalp, gleamed faintly in the cold light, and the lines etched deep into his face told stories of battles fought and years endured. Yet his piercing blue eyes burned with an intensity that cut through the clamor, scanning the scene with a soldier's precision, searching for something or someone. His broad shoulders, still squared despite the passage of time, seemed to anchor the moment, as if he could hold back the chaos with sheer will. Mark Davis, a local man who had seen his share of crises, stepped forward, his hand raised in a gesture of recognition. Their eyes locked, and James gave a single sharp nod, a silent acknowledgement that carried decades of trust. Without hesitation, he strode toward the center of the scene, where Frank Miller lay, frail and fading on the cold pavement. Frank's voice, though weak, sliced through the surrounding noise like a blade honed by years of resolve. James dropped to one knee, his large hands enveloping Frank's thin, trembling fingers, with a gentleness that belied his commanding presence. "I'm here, old friend," James murmured, his voice thick with emotion, a vow fulfilled. "I'm here." Frank's eyes fluttered open, a faint spark of life breaking through the haze of pain and exhaustion. "James," he whispered, his cracked lips curving into a smile so subtle it might have been missed by anyone but the man kneeling before him. That smile held a lifetime, grief, pride, and the quiet relief of recognition. "You still remember?" Frank's voice was barely audible, yet it carried the weight of a shared history. James let out a short, rough laugh, caught somewhere between sorrow and fierce loyalty. "I told you," he said, his grip tightening as if he could hold Frank to this world a moment longer. "Did you think I'd forget a promise we made in a damn jungle 50 years ago?" His words hung in the air, raw and unyielding, pulling the crowd into a stunned silence. The onlookers, shop owners, delivery drivers, teenagers who had paused their restless wandering, stood frozen, their cameras forgotten at their sides. The moment was too sacred to capture, too heavy to interrupt. Sarah, a young woman standing nearby, felt her chest tighten as she watched the two men. Her heart pounded, not from fear but from the overwhelming sense of witnessing something profound, something that reached beyond the street and into the depths of human connection. She glanced from James to Frank, her breath catching as she sensed the magnitude of their bond, a story forged in fire and blood, now playing out in this quiet town under a vast winter sky. A young firefighter, his helmet tucked under his arm, stepped closer, his voice hushed as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. Who is this man?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity and reverence. Mark Davis turned slightly, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of truth. "Frank Miller, Marine, Vietnam vet, saved half a unit with his bare hands, carried men out under fire. Took a bullet for that man right there." He nodded toward James, his words deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. "And he never asked for a damn thing in return." The firefighter's jaw slackened, his gaze shifting between the two men. Whispers rippled through the crowd as others began to piece together the story, their faces softening with awe and understanding. For years, Frank Miller had walked these streets unnoticed, a quiet figure blending into the rhythm of the town. Now, in this moment, his life was laid bare, its heroism illuminated for all to see. James leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching Frank's, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for his friend. "You gave me 50 years, Frank. 50 years you should have had. You didn't owe me today, but I owed you." His words were a confession, a debt acknowledged across decades. Frank's eyes shimmered, a thin mist clouding his gaze as his fingers twitched faintly in James's grasp. "Semper Fi," Frank whispered, the words a sacred echo of their shared past. James's smile was tight, his jaw clenched against the tide of grief threatening to break through. "Semper Fi, Marine," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm in his heart. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed to shrink, the thrum of the waiting Blackhawk helicopter fading into a distant hum. All that remained was the circle of quiet around two old men, a general and a hero, bound by a promise kept across half a century. Then Frank's breath caught, a soft hitch that seemed to pull the air from the street. His fingers loosened in James's grip, and a serene calm settled over his face, as if a burden he'd carried for decades had finally slipped away. His final smile, faint but proud, lingered like a beacon in the growing dusk. James remained still, his head bowed, his hands cradling Frank's as if they held something irreplaceable. The crowd watched in hushed reverence, the cold air thick with the unspoken understanding that they were witnessing something rare. A moment of pure, unadulterated loyalty, not just a reunion, but a homecoming. Sarah wiped at her cheeks, unaware of when the tears had begun to fall. Her hands trembled, not from the chill, but from the weight of what she'd seen. Around her, the crowd stood in silence, their faces reflecting a shared sense of awe. Police officers had cordoned off the area, but no one moved to leave. Neighbors, shopkeepers, even the teenagers who had been passing through stood rooted, their eyes fixed on the two men at the heart of it all. When Frank's breath finally stilled, when that faint smile settled into eternity, the only sound was the soft whistle of the winter wind. James exhaled slowly, his shoulders still square, though his eyes betrayed the depth of his loss. He lifted his head, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, not just at Sarah, but at the strangers who had become witnesses to this sacred moment. People who had passed Frank by for years without knowing his name, his story, or the weight of his sacrifices. Clearing his throat, James's voice broke the silence, rough with emotion, but steady with purpose. "I owe you all an explanation," he said. The murmurs in the crowd hushed, and even the police and firefighters edged closer, drawn by curiosity and respect. Sarah wiped her cheek again, her heart pounding as she leaned in, unable to look away. James took a deep breath, as if bracing himself against the weight of 50 years. 50 years ago, he began, his voice carrying the cadence of a man who had lived every word. I was a 20-year-old lieutenant in a jungle halfway across the world, scared out of my mind, but too stubborn to admit it. And Frank, he paused, glancing down at his friend, his eyes glistening. Frank was the one who kept us alive, kept me alive. He didn't just carry men out of that hell, he carried hope, loyalty, everything that makes a man more than just a soldier. His words wove a spell over the crowd, pulling them into a story of courage and brotherhood. Sarah felt her chest ache, not just for Frank, but for James, who had carried this debt, this promise, for half a century. The helicopter's engines hummed steadily in the background, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. Under the white cold sky, the town stood still, honoring a man who had walked among them, unnoticed, until this final radiant moment when his story was told. In the dense, unforgiving jungles of Vietnam, I was barely more than a boy, young, brash, and foolishly convinced I could handle whatever the war threw at me. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and bravado, a cocktail of emotions that made me feel invincible, despite the sweat trickling down my spine. A fleeting smirk crossed my lips, a nervous tick, but it vanished as quickly as it came, swallowed by the weight of the moment. Then the ambush hit. The jungle erupted into chaos. Bullets zipped through the air, tearing leaves to shreds, while explosions rattled the earth beneath my boots. The cries of my comrades pierced the haze, each shout a stab to my gut. I was cut off from my squad, pinned behind the smoldering wreckage of a convoy truck, my legs screaming in pain from a shrapnel wound. Blood soaked through my fatigues, warm and sticky, and as I pressed my back against the twisted metal, a cold dread settled in. This was it. I was going to die here, alone in the mud. James paused, his voice catching as he recounted the memory, his weathered fingers grazing Frank's still hand, resting on the stretcher. The crowd around him leaned closer, hanging on every word, their faces a mix of awe and sorrow. Back then, I didn't know Frank's name, James continued, his voice softer now, tinged with reverence. All I saw was this Marine, grit and determination carved into his face, dragging two wounded men across the jungle floor, bullets kicking up dirt around him. He could have kept going. Hell, he should have. Any sane man would have prioritized his own survival. But not Frank. James's throat tightened, and his eyes glistened with the weight of a debt he'd carried for decades. He saw me, trapped, bleeding out, and he didn't hesitate. He hauled me out from under that truck, slung me over his shoulder like I was nothing more than a sack of gear, and ran. Bullets chased us, snapping branches, grazing his arm. He took one clean through the flesh, blood streaming down. But he didn't falter. Not once. He got us to safety, every last one of us. And he did it with the kind of courage that doesn't come from training or orders, but from something deeper, something unbreakable. Gasps rippled through the crowd. soft murmurs of disbelief and admiration, hands pressed to mouths, stifling quiet sobs. Sarah, standing close, felt her breath hitch, her chest tight with emotion she couldn't name. Her eyes darted to the Blackhawk helicopter idling nearby, its blades casting long shadows across the street, as if it too stood in silent respect. James glanced at it briefly, drawing strength from its presence, a symbol of the life he and Frank had once shared. After the war, we went our separate ways, he said, his voice steadier now, but still heavy with memory. Frank didn't want fanfare, didn't care for medals or recognition. All he wanted was a quiet life, a chance to slip back into the world without the weight of what he'd done hanging over him. And he got it. He built a life here in this town. Simple, unassuming, the kind of life where you'd never guess the hero he was. Meanwhile, I stayed in the service, chasing wars and duty, but we never lost touch. Not really. His gaze dropped to Frank's face, pale and lined with age, yet still carrying that quiet strength. James's voice softened to a near whisper, as if sharing a secret with the crowd. One cold night, years ago, after too many drinks, we made a pact. A promise born of brotherhood, sealed with the kind of trust only men who've faced death together can understand. We swore that if either of us ever needed the other, no matter how many years had passed, no matter the distance, the other would come. No questions, no hesitation. James gave a small, bittersweet chuckle, shaking his head as if he could still hear Frank's voice. He told me, half laughing, if I go down, don't let it be in the dark. Don't let it be alone. I promised him I wouldn't, and today he called in that promise. The silence that followed was heavy, almost tangible, as if the air itself held its breath. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes, hot and unrelenting, and she wasn't alone. Around her, the townsfolk, ordinary people who'd known Frank as the quiet man at the grocery store or the guy who nodded politely at the bakery, wiped their faces, their expressions shifting from shock to reverence. The woman who ran the bakery, her apron still dusted with flour, pressed a trembling hand to her lips. An older man from the hardware store, his face weathered like old leather, stared at the ground, his jaw tight. Even the teenagers who'd been laughing and joking just moments ago stood silent, their usual restlessness replaced by something deeper. Respect maybe, or the dawning realization of what true heroism looked like. A firefighter, his uniform crisp despite the weight of the moment, broke the stillness, his voice low and rough. All this time, he said, shaking his head, and none of us had a clue. Mark Davis, a local who'd known Frank for years, stood nearby, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He gave a curt nod, his eyes distant but proud. That's who Frank was, he said simply. Never needed the spotlight, never wanted anyone to make a fuss, just did what needed doing and moved on. The crowd stirred, a subtle ripple of connection passing through them. Hands reached out instinctively. Husbands clasping their wives' fingers, parents pulling their children close, neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder in a quiet show of unity. Sarah felt a stranger's arms slip around her shoulders, a woman she didn't even know, but she didn't pull away. There was comfort in the gesture, a shared grief and gratitude that bound them all in that moment. James let his hand rest on Frank's chest, his touch gentle but firm, as if anchoring himself to the man who'd saved him all those years ago. Then he looked up at the crowd again, his voice steady but laced with emotion. Frank Miller was a hero long before today, he said. He didn't need a helicopter or a general's salute to prove it. He didn't need a crowd chanting his name. But maybe, just maybe, it's not too late for us to remember who he was, to honor the life he lived when no one was watching. Sarah's heart ached as she watched James stand, his movements deliberate, carrying the quiet dignity of a soldier paying his final respects. The wind picked up, sweeping through the street, tugging at the flag draped over the back of the fire truck. It fluttered with a soft snap, and a hush fell over the crowd, the kind of silence that carries more weight than words ever could. Sarah's mind drifted to all the times she'd seen Frank in passing, at the grocery store offering a small nod as he paid for his bread and milk, walking home with a paper bag tucked under his arm, his steps slow but steady. She'd never thought twice about him, never imagined the stories hidden behind those kind, weathered eyes. Now she knew she'd carry his memory forever, a quiet vow, etched into her heart. As the Blackhawk's engines thrummed, waiting patiently, the town stood frozen under the vast, cold sky. Sarah whispered under her breath, her voice barely audible, but fervent. "Thank you, Frank." The words felt inadequate, yet they carried the weight of her gratitude, her regret for not knowing sooner. She wasn't alone. Around her, others began to echo the sentiment, their voices soft and choked with emotion. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." The words wove through the crowd, a quiet chorus of reverence for a man who'd walked among them unnoticed for so long. The medics moved in, their hands gentle as they lifted Frank's frail body onto the stretcher. The crowd parted instinctively, like a silent wave, giving them space but never looking away. Sarah stayed by his side, her fingers still wrapped around his hand, unwilling to let go just yet. She felt the faintest pressure, a weak, fleeting squeeze, like a whisper of life through his skin before his fingers relaxed completely as the medics secured the straps. Frank's eyelids fluttered open one last time, his pale blue eyes finding Sarah's. They held a steadiness, a quiet peace, as if he knew the impact of his life, even now at the end. And then, as the medics carried him toward the waiting helicopter, the town stood in quiet vigil, honoring a hero not with fanfare or medals, but with the simple, profound gratitude of those whose lives he'd touched, knowingly or not. In the dimming glow of a life nearing its end, Frank Miller's faint voice carried a weight that anchored the moment. "Thank you for not walking away," he whispered, his words brittle, like dry leaves caught in a late autumn breeze. Each syllable seemed to cost him, yet they landed with a clarity that silenced the world around Sarah. Her chest tightened, a flood of emotions, grief, gratitude, and something unnameable, welling up as tears stung her eyes. She leaned closer, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear, her throat constricting with the effort to hold back a sob. "You're welcome, Frank," she managed, her voice soft but steady, a promise woven into the words. "You're not alone." The assurance felt like a lifeline, not just for Frank, but for her own trembling heart, which now beat with a fierce resolve to stay by his side. On the opposite side of the stretcher, James Henderson stood, his weathered face a map of memories carved by years of camaraderie and conflict. The lines etched around his eyes spoke of battles fought together, of moments when survival hinged on trust forged in the crucible of war. He bent low, his forehead nearly brushing Frank's, as if to share the weight of their shared past one last time. "You're a hero," James said, his voice a quiet rumble, thick with unspoken stories. "Always were, you just never wanted anyone to know." The words were a confession, a recognition of the man Frank had been, unassuming, steadfast, carrying the burden of his valor in silence. Frank's lips twitched into the ghost of a smile, a fleeting expression of peace, as if he were finally letting go of a weight he'd carried too long. His fingers stirred faintly, a subtle gesture, perhaps a salute to a memory only he could see, vivid and sacred in his fading mind. "Semper Fi," he breathed, the words barely louder than the wind rustling through the nearby trees, and then his eyes drifted shut. His chest rose once, twice, then stilled, as if the world itself had paused to honor his departure. The medics stood frozen, their hands resting lightly on the stretcher, unwilling to disturb the sanctity of the moment. The crowd, moments ago restless with murmurs and shifting feet, fell into a profound silence, as if the air itself held its breath. Mark Davis, a man of few words but unyielding presence, broke the quiet. "Let's give him a minute," he said, his voice steady but softened by reverence. Without prompting, the townsfolk, strangers, neighbors, friends who had never truly known Frank, bowed their heads. The moment stretched, heavy and sacred, as the wind swept gently down the street, stirring leaves along the gutter. A flag on a nearby lamppost fluttered, its red and white stripes catching the fading afternoon light, a silent sentinel to the scene. Somewhere in the distance, a child's curious voice was hushed by a mother's gentle hand, as if even the youngest understood the gravity of the moment. Sarah closed her eyes, the warmth of Frank's hand still lingering in her palm, a fleeting connection that felt like a vow she hadn't known she'd made. Her heart ached with the realization that this man, so unassuming in life, had left an indelible mark in his final moments. When the minute passed, James straightened, his movements slow, deliberate, as if reluctant to let go of the moment. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, but his jaw was set, a soldier's resolve holding him steady. He placed a hand on Frank's shoulder, gave it a brief, tender squeeze, a final farewell to a brother in arms, and stepped back. The Blackhawk helicopter waited nearby, its rotors turning in slow, patient circles, a mechanical heartbeat echoing the town's collective grief. As the medics lifted the stretcher and moved toward the helicopter, the crowd parted silently, instinctively, creating a path for Frank Miller. This quiet Marine, a man who had lived among them as a shadow, was now carried through the heart of the town, not as a stranger, but as a hero whose story was only just beginning to be told. A week later, the town gathered again, not in the case of that fateful week, but in a shared act of remembrance. The small square outside City Hall brimmed with people, more than Sarah had ever seen in one place. Flags lined the streets, each lowered to half-staff, their colors muted in the winter light. A long black banner stretched across the front of City Hall, its simple inscription reading, "In memory of Frank Miller, a quiet hero." The mayor stood at the podium, his voice steady as he recounted Frank's service, his courage in battles long past, his quiet life among them, a life that had gone unnoticed until it could no longer be ignored. But it was Sarah's words that pierced the crowd's heart. She stepped up to the microphone, clutching a small piece of paper, though her trembling hands betrayed her nerves. She barely glanced at the notes, her words flowing from a place deeper than any script could capture. "I didn't know Frank before last week," she began, her voice soft but clear, carrying across the silent crowd. "To me, he was just an old man I passed on the street, buying his groceries, living his life quietly, like so many of us do. But in one moment when he collapsed, I saw who he really was, and I realized how much we all missed by not seeing him sooner." She paused, her gaze flickering to the front row where James and Mark sat, their heads bowed, their silence a testament to their shared loss. Frank was a Marine, a hero who carried his past with a strength so quiet it was easy to overlook. He never asked for recognition, never demanded to be seen. But he was a reminder, a lesson, that every person we pass has a story, a depth we might never know unless we stop to look. Her voice wavered and she smiled through the tears that spilled down her cheeks. "I'll never forget the day Frank Miller taught all of us that kindness matters, that noticing matters, that a single moment of care can echo through a lifetime." As the ceremony drew to a close, the crowd moved toward a newly placed memorial stone near the city's war monument. The plaque gleamed in the winter sun, its inscription stark and powerful. "Frank Miller, a quiet hero, semper fi." People lined up, their footsteps soft against the cold ground, to place flowers, small flags, and handwritten notes at its base. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves asking who Frank was, and for the first time his name was spoken with reverence, not as a vague memory, but as a symbol of quiet courage. News crews from across the state arrived, their cameras capturing the scene, and within days, Frank's story spread to national outlets. Thousands across the country learned of a man whose life had been invisible for so long, now illuminated in death. Among the crowd, the grocery store clerk who had rung up Frank's bread and apples stood quietly, wiping her eyes. "I never knew," she whispered, her voice thick with regret for the conversations she never had. High school students who had once sped past Frank's house on their bikes now stood with bowed heads, hands clasped, their youthful indifference replaced by a newfound respect. Sarah lingered at the edge of the crowd, her heart heavy yet full, as if something fundamental had shifted within her. She understood now, in a way she hadn't before, that no one should be invisible, that no one should face their final moments alone. Frank's quiet life had left behind a resounding echo, a call to notice, to care, to act. As the days passed, the town carried Frank's lesson forward. Neighbors spoke more openly, sharing quiet reflections on the man they'd overlooked. They began to see each other differently, to pause at the grocery store, to nod at the stranger on the sidewalk. Frank's story reminded them that heroes don't always stand out in a crowd, don't always wear their medals or proclaim their deeds. Often they walk among us, their greatest acts hidden in the past, carried silently in their hearts. His life was a testament to the power of small gestures, A kind word, a moment of attention, a hand extended in care. These acts, so simple yet so profound, could change a life or honor one that had quietly touched many. In the end, Frank Miller's legacy was not just in the battles he'd fought or the medals he'd never displayed, but in the way he'd reminded a town and a nation to see the unseen, to honor the quiet, and to never let a life pass unnoticed.